wall testing and consulting establishment, and we continued in the last decade to initiate as well as expand the understanding of the region for fire compliance. We have a fairly large fire testing laboratory, probably the largest in the whole of MENA region, with 4 working fire resistance furnaces, a slew of reaction to fire testing apparatus, as well as probably the world's only facility that houses fire propagation tests as per the British as well as the American standards, which is the VS 8414 and the NFP 285, as you can see in the screen. We will be continuing our journey of awareness, and today we will be talking very specifically about the Chapter 18 of the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code. Usually I talk about passive fire and compliance. Today's session is very specific, related to UAE, and more so related to the Chapter 18 of the Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice. Let me just continue to unmute people. I will start the session today by a very interesting infographic that I saw in an article. The article was published in a magazine in the UK, which was talking about the investigations post Grenfell. And it is a very interesting article which tries to explain this, state of affairs of what is called the duty holder. The duty holder is expected to know and do a lot of things at the same time. And today's session, I want to tie in some words, these words like responsible, liable, law, contracts, enforcement. These are very interesting words that keep popping up all throughout the life cycle of construction. And whenever there is a fire incident, unfortunately, all these words suddenly become very, very important. And there are times that post-fire incidents, these words are redefined, reassigned, etc., etc. People who have been following the investigation after the Grenfell tragedy would agree with me that it is quite a complicated task often to have an agreement of how responsibilities and liabilities are defined as well as assigned. So today's session is specific to UAE, and let me jump into creating a context of how responsibilities and liabilities have been coming to fore and how the code and code's implementation has come to be. All of you would be familiar, the last 30 years have seen a phenomenal growth in the country. And one of the key features of the country is that it welcomes the future. The image that you see is of a very interesting monument coming up, which is the Museum of the Future, to welcome the future. And UAE has been the pioneer in welcoming people from all backgrounds, as well as anybody and everybody who aspires. So this is a very important starting point for us to understand that how the Fire and Life Safety Code has come to be and has later evolved. People coming from different comprehensions of compliance, different comprehensions of code, as well as different backgrounds and perception of safety, fire safety, health and fire safety. It is quite an uphill task to bring about a document which is simple to understand for everybody. People come from different languages, different cultures, as well as the country has been very, very quick to create a legal framework the moment they published a Fire and Life Safety Code back in 2011. So in 2012, the ministerial decree was published. And over the years, when the code was being revised into the current version of 2018, the ministerial decree was amended and a new decree, which is the Decree 213, came into force. And it came into force very specifically to keep in mind two very unique aspects of the code. One which we will be talking about today, which is the chapter 18, which is the chapter which it talks about the responsibilities of stakeholders. And another very related part of the code, which is that all the standards which are referenced in the fire and life safety code do not have a year of publication, which means that there is actually an expectation that the moment the code or the standard is revised, the latest version is used and is brought about, is used in practice. Now, this is a very unique part of the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code. And it kind of creates a background for everybody to understand that the learning of the authority having jurisdiction here has been immense when they analyze lots of fire incidents that have been happening in the region around the world. There is one learning which is very specific about the lag between the changes in the types of materials that are available, the new versions of the standards as well as code, etc. Can I get a feedback? If I'm getting some feedback, people can't hear me. Can you hear me? Am I audible to everybody?
From here, sir.
Yes, audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Super. Going back to the fact that the context of this chapter is very, very important. So let me move forward to the next stage, that keeping in mind this context that people need to comply to the latest version, latest revision of the code to minimize any lag that is happening between the development of the new standards and codes and implementation of these new standards and codes. The chapter 18 is a very comprehensive chapter because the authority having jurisdiction has divided and handed over the responsibilities of whatever new developments, new materials are being used, how to use them effectively and bring about fire safety to several stakeholders. In the UAE code, there are about 20 such stakeholders that have been listed. I have added a few, as many as I could have added in this slide. So before I move forward and I jump into how these stakeholders have their responsibilities out there, I would like to open a quick poll for everybody to just fill in and answer some of the questions that will help me build today's session forward. I look forward to the answers of people who are in the session today. This is going to be very, very helpful, as I see that, for example, there are a fair bit of consultants who are in the audience, and the number of manufacturers are also growing in. So in today's session, I would be not able to talk about all the stakeholders who are listed in the chapter 18. I'm going to be talking about two specific stakeholders, which is the contractor and the material supplier. And while I talk about them, I will later take two case studies to kind of detail how these are implemented on the ground. And the reason why I pick up contractor and material supplier, because I feel that these two stakeholders are very, very close to the practical implementation of the fire and life safety code of practice. I'm sure you would agree that many stakeholders, ranging from the owner or the architect or the tenant and so many others may not necessarily be practically involved when the implementation of the fire and life safety is in process. So I'll finish off the poll now. Thank you very, very much. If there are some more people who would like to punch in their answers, it would be very, very helpful. So moving forward, and I'll talk about contractors and why contractors' role is important. As I explained, it is the key stakeholder in the process of implementation. And I love the fact that the word contractor is having the word contract in itself. And it is this contract which positions the contractor very, very uniquely. There are lots of responsibilities that the main contractor or even the subcontractor have. And the fact that they have entered into an agreement or a contract which has commercial as well as technical requirements in place makes it an excellent target for a stakeholder that not only has a lot of responsibilities, but also has the capability of passing on many of these responsibilities and liabilities by entering into a contract with other people. For example, the contract between the contractor and the material supplier or the inspection body has the capability to pass on some of the responsibilities that are defined and entrusted upon the contractor in the fire and life safety code. So as you would see on your screen, there is quite a bit of detail involved in defining several requirements. And these requirements are defined because from the time when the project is designed, from the time when initial specifications are written, or even the specifications are, or the drawings are approved by the civil defense, there could be an instance where the project which gets delayed, which starts much later, a lot of things have changed. So it is the expectation of the authority having jurisdiction, which is the civil defense, that it is the main contractor or the contractor or subcontractor who is familiar with understanding the fire and life safety code of practice, who has the competence within themselves to distinguish as well as implement the fire and life safety code of practice and assess if there are any specific changes that might have actually occurred from the time the project was initially approved. People who are familiar with the UAE and projects in not just the Middle East or the Gulf, but all over the world where construction projects can get delayed, sometimes long enough that the codes change, the test methods change, the perception of risks change. So keeping all of these things in mind, the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code has tried to do an excellent job in trying to actually assess and write these things. I'm going to walk through some clauses of the requirements in the subsequent slides. So for want of them not becoming boring, I'm highlighting some parts which are important, and I'm going to walk through when I take examples about these. That when it comes to contractual requirements, it is the contractor's responsibility to verify that suppliers of fire and life safety systems, devices, equipment, materials have valid license for products and company registration from individual Emirates Civil Defense before placing the order for products and making any agreement with them. So the language has a lot of words which must be understood when they say it is the contractor's responsibility. It means that it is allowing the contractor to subcontract this responsibility, to part away with his responsibility by to anybody else they seem or deem who can do this. Going forward, it is the contractor's responsibility to verify material test certificates and specifications in accordance with the latest edition of the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice. I can see some questions coming in, and please keep them coming in. I'm going to address all the questions at the end of the session. Now, moving forward, approvals. It is the contractor's responsibility to insist on detailed material specifications in accordance to the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice from the consultant. The text of the code has a lot of areas where responsibilities are defined, where scope of work is defined. The contractor shall not start executing the work on the site with construction, earthwork, installation, programming, or any such activity without final civil defense approved drawings from the consultant. But this said, in the subsequent slides, I would say that the contractor is also prohibited to install or use any materials, products, components that are not registered and listed with civil defense. There are several instances where a lot of responsibility is entrusted on the shoulders of the contractor. We see on a practical level that this happens a lot, that the work on given projects is already started, already begun, without the correct contracts in place, without the correct clauses in place, with materials which are being used, which are not approved. And going forward, as this code gets implemented more and more strictly, going forward as all those projects come under the purview of the code, which have started after the code was published, after the law and the decree 213 was published in 2017, it will not only become difficult for various stakeholders to start work, start projects, use materials which is unapproved material on the projects, but I suspect that the government can become more and more strict on suppliers and contractors and several stakeholders by handing them over fines, handing them over any and every kind of punishment that they seem or deem valid. Code compliance, again, there was a line in one of the slides earlier where the contractor relies with the drawings that are approved by the consultant in civil defense. But it is very specifically written that an approved drawing from civil defense from the consultant does not relieve the contractor from adhering to detailed installation requirements in accordance to the latest edition of the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code. So these sections, again, make sure that there is space available for civil defense and various authorities to make sure that if the codes are getting revised while the projects are on, there is some stakeholder who is responsible for implementing the intent of the code. We talk about installation guidelines from manufacturers, and this ties in very beautifully the fact that suppliers of fire safety products, materials, have a lot of responsibility in defining and detailing how their products are to be installed. Because the guarantees and warranties from manufacturers suddenly become void if the products are not installed as per the manufacturer's guidelines. And you could be in a situation where the manufacturer or the supplier says their product will not perform if not installed as per their instructions. And hence it is the duty and the responsibility of the contractors to not only know this, but also do it right. Here again, there is linking between the scopes and responsibilities of contractors and owners, that it is the responsibility of the contractor to highlight to the owner directly any non-compliances that are existing in systems for the owner's action. Let's look at material suppliers or manufacturers agents, and they go to great detail in explaining several requirements, and I'm going to walk through some of these in the slides that are going to come. Approvals. We get this question a lot, that manufacturers who are supplying materials in the UAE probably for the first time get an approval from a emirate, which could be Dubai or Abu Dhabi or any others. And they expect that the product is approved to be sold all over the country. The code is very clear in several sections that it is each emirate's individual requirements when it comes to commercial compliance, not technical compliance, commercial compliance, whether they want additional methods for the product to be sold and registered in each emirate. So a product which is approved in Abu Dhabi may not necessarily be approved in Dubai until or unless Dubai Civil Defense has the product registered within themselves. It is the local manufacturer's responsibility to identify and understand the registration and approval process in one emirate and the other emirate. It does not automatically approve you for the whole country. The Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice is a federal document from a technical compliance point of view, but from a commercial selling material point of view, the manufacturers need to go to each emirate and understand what could be the local requirements. Often misunderstood in many countries, this is very clearly defined in the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of what is considered as a manufacturer or manufacturing process. Assembling and relabeling, etc., is not considered as someone manufacturing a product. And this comes specifically because it is considered that a manufacturer has the responsibility to test their products, their materials and systems only through registered and approved material laboratories and certification bodies. And this is a very common practice in the world when it comes to selling and supplying materials, that a manufacturer who is present in a given country has a manufacturing facility, and a similar or same quality product supposedly is manufactured in another location, which could be a branch of the manufacturer. But this is something that civil defense does not directly accept. Civil defense needs a third-party body who is witnessing the factory production control, who is taking ownership of reliability and repeatability of that given manufacturing location. And hence, the process of civil defense approval, which has the requirement of certificate of conformity or a COC, this certificate of conformity needs to have several specific pieces of data, which is issued by the third-party certification body. And this COC links the manufacturing location, the listing of specific products, with the clauses of the Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice. So they provide a very essential and key link between the code and the factories or manufacturers who are producing specific products which are complying to the code. Now, it is considered the manufacturer's responsibility to revise the conformity of his material, product, or systems where modifications and alterations to design, components, compositions, performance criteria have been executed. So as you see, the responsibility has been given to the manufacturer. Any changes in his product or material is his responsibility, and the manufacturer needs to update his testing and certification documentation, as well as resubmit all of this data to the civil defense. Cross-listing and multiple listing is very clearly and specifically defined in the code. And you must understand that violation of any of these requirements shall hold the manufacturer as responsible, and it is punishable by law. So the code, by virtue of its language, creates a very specific space for the decree and the implementation of the law, so that they can start invoking the law to make sure that it is implemented correctly. So before I take on a case study, I'm going to open a quick poll for all of you to just practice your fingers and give me a second to sip water. While I encourage you all to quickly finish off the simple questions that I'm asking in the poll, if you have any questions or queries related to these sections I just show on the screen, please feel free to write in your questions or queries. And of course, I'm going to pick up the easy questions and reply to them at the end of the webinar. A few more seconds, and I'm going to move to the case study, which I will try and use to show how some of these clauses sit on in a very practical level on the ground when the codes get implemented. A lot of you will be familiar with fire doors and how fire doors are defined. The UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice defines minimum requirements. And these minimum requirements are a very good starting point for manufacturers who want to start getting into developing and selling products in the country. They create a minimum requirement for a lot of people in the supply chain to understand the types of products that should be manufactured or produced in the country for a given requirement. The code is also very clear in defining compliance requirements. What is the installation, inspection, and maintenance requirement? And this is defined very clearly because there are stakeholders who are responsible for all of these aspects. Door labeling, as an example, shall be verified to confirm the fire rating, valid test certifications, and test standards it was tested to. This is a minimum requirement as per the code. So when it comes to compliance, who is responsibility of the contractor? He needs to understand how this works, how to verify, what are the tools available for labeling, are they the correct tools or not? Inspection, how it should be done, what are the requirements of inspections, and what are the minimum criteria for inspections are detailed at great length in the code. And here again, this is something that I mentioned earlier as well, that not only there is a requirement of listing and certification, you would see that 7.1.2 the clause after the red marking, very clearly and in bold defines that there is no year of addition for the test methods which are referenced in the code, not only in this clause or in this section, but all across the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice. And I believe that this has come on the back of the learning that civil defense has seen and experienced, that when standards get revised, when test methods get revised, in several countries, the implementation cycle is long enough that several buildings, several occupancies, and constructions are already out there. So while the code has been very clear and open about handing out the responsibilities of choosing the standards, choosing specific requirements depending on their understanding of the projects, it has also given the responsibility of ensuring that the latest version which is applicable, the latest version which has taken into consideration all the learnings from accidents as well as people trying to evade requirements in the code, has been put in place. Let's take an example. We'll take an example of a fire door which is getting implemented in a specific project. Now, the architect, the designer, or the consultant of a given occupancy, for example, a hotel or a hospital or a high-rise building, could be designed from a country which follows a specific set of standards. As an example, American standards are very commonly used sometimes by architects. And hence, the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code is very clear on giving a choice to the contractors as well as consultants to come up with the correct flow of standards. The Fire and Life Safety strategy has kept in mind American standards, has kept in mind a flow which comes from an American group of standards. Then obviously it makes a lot of sense that the products which are used to implement the fire and life safety strategy, whether it is active fire protection or passive fire protection, all align to American standards. And these interpretations are again doled out and entrusted towards different stakeholders in the project. As I said, when we take an example of a fire door, if we take an example that there is a hotel, which is a 550 room hotel and has maybe close to 900 fire rated doors, depending on where the hotel's design is originating from, it could demand a specific set of standards. And what is released, which is a door schedule, which forms almost the tender document or the RFQ document from the main contractor to the door suppliers, details several aspects which will ensure that the fire doors which will get procured and installed are actually fire rated. So here, it is not only the responsibility of the fire door supplier to ensure that they have all the documentation in place to prove that all the doors and door types and door designs and door combinations that they are supplying for a given project are complying to the code, to the code's minimum requirements set in to prove and demonstrate compliance, to the specification document. So if, for example, the project wants doors to be rated to American standards, then the certification and listing has to be to American standards. If some components are changing, then it again comes down to the responsibility of the contractor to ensure that there is compliance and there is means of compliance available. There is proof of compliance which is available, which can be demonstrated. In several cases, retesting may be mandatory because the certification body will not write an engineering judgment for the deviations that are coming in. So how do you verify all of this? Here is a quick example. If somebody submits to you a certificate, and how do you really validate the certificate? Almost all certification bodies have listing, and these listings are fairly detailed, often carry a lot of information, enough for the manufacturer to verify that the product which has come to them at the construction site, where has it come from? Is it complying to the requirements of the purchase order? Is it complying to the requirements or the technical specifications of the given project? And there are several requirements that are detailed in these listing documents for the purpose of verification. The listing requirements often form the basis for an inspection body or a third-party inspector to verify that what has been delivered and installed, is it detailed as listed? And if not, it is the duty and the mandatory requirement of the contractor or whoever the contractor has subcontracted this responsibility to, which could be an inspection body, is able to verify all of these things. And if not, raise a concern and bring it out. Because if they do not, and there is an incident that happens, then they are the ones who are considered responsible and liable. So the tools are out there. The certification bodies, all of them provide several documents, several tools which are publicly available for the stakeholders to fulfill their duties, their requirements, and so on and so forth. I'll take a quick example of cladding. It is something which is close to our heart as a subject, because for the last 25 years, we have been involved with building envelopes as products, materials, and suppliers. A lot of you may already be familiar with this, that the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code has requirements which are defined at two levels or two tiers. The materials, which are required to show by virtue of reaction to fire properties, whether they are ignitable or combustible, or whether they are the right components to be chosen to design a system. But also the requirements of the UAE Fire and Life Safety go on to detail choices between large-scale fire tests of American origin or British origin or even ISO standards, to provide the tools for assurance of every project. People who are in the cladding industry are very, very familiar with the fact that cladding of each building needs to be unique, wants to be unique. And hence, for any given project, there could be several dozen drawings, if not hundreds of drawings, which detail various combinations of materials and components. And it is the responsibility and duty of the contractor, of the designer, to have assurance that what they have designed, will it comply to the requirements of the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code? As a summary, this level of risk assessment needs to be done on the basis of data which is available. The reaction to fire tests mentioned in the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code, like the European classification as per the EN standards, ASTM-D 1929, for example, for ignitability of plastics. These are some of the basic building blocks that are defined in the code as requirements that can enable designers to ensure that they design a system, a cladding system, which is safe. The UAE Fire and Life Safety Code then goes on to define the assembly tests, which they recognize as the correct means to ensure that the systems that have been designed that will be implemented are not only complying to the code, not only giving the proof that they are safe, but also they create test reports to great detail to allow the inspection bodies and the inspectors to check that the installation is not done in ways that obviates all the activity and all the work that has been done. So This brings me to the last slide, where I have tried to define and detail the requirements in the responsibilities section. And I now have a bit of a poll, which I'm going to open for everyone to take your try at attempting to answer some of these questions, which are based on some of the requirements that some of the things that I have detailed today. And while I move to the last slide and to touch up upon how these things can go in specifications and contracts, I will let you finish attempting these questions, and I'll take a small pause to read through some of the thoughts and questions coming in the chat, which can be addressed at the end of this workshop. So while I let everybody finish off some of the easy or not so easy questions that I have tried to create in the poll, let me add that I'm going to send back the correct answers to everybody who is attempting all the questions. So we have a record of each person who is logged in and what the answers are of each participant. And so anybody who is keen to know the correct answers, which are just nothing but simple questions, please make sure that you attempt all of them. And in the reply that I'm going to send out to you after the webinar in a day or two, I'm going to make sure that you know what the answers are as per the chapter 18 of the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice. Now, this is the slide that you see on your screen is something that I aim to talk at a greater length in the next webinar, which is towards the end of the month. The registrations are open, which are available on the same link that you have all registered earlier on. And it is a very interesting insight for understanding that how technical specifications and contracts can use the language of the code, use the correct understanding of the third-party testing, inspection, and certification tools to ensure that the responsibility and the liabilities, which are defined in commercial contracts, have not only a clear implication to the monies involved in the project, but also have a very, very clear implication saying what is the responsibility of the contractee and what is the responsibility of the contractor, for example, someone who is entering into an agreement or into a contract between two parties. And there are 20 such stakeholders who are defined in the Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice. And it's very interesting to understand that at the end of all of this, there are only two elements, which is commerce or commercial agreements and law. So what is the basic tools for everyone that are available to implement these? The law, which is the Decree 213, which has been published and is available for anybody to see and study, as well as the commercial contracts, which are in access of everybody and everybody can look through these commercial contracts. So while I let you all see the page, which again defines my contact details and the details of the email addresses, I'm going to start replying to some of the questions that have been coming in on the chat. And if any of you have any other questions, please continue to write them in, and I'm going to take them one by one. So I'm going to start with I'll go sequentially. Isn't the contractor referred in the UAE fire code and fire contractors who do the fire and life safety systems installation? So yes, as I said, there are 20 stakeholders and many types of contractors that are referred in the code. I would encourage you to look up the code. I had given the link of where the code is saved on the internet, but you can always just Google it up. And it's a very, very interesting read for people who have not actually read through this chapter 18. It's quite an eye-opening chapter, and I am very, very sure that it will open probably even business opportunity for some people. The next question is, which code take precedence when an emirate has a more stringent code than the UAE FLS code? Such as an example would be Abu Dhabi International Building Code. In some instances, is far more stringent in the UAE FLS code. So in my understanding, the UAE FLS code is a federal code. And just like every code in the world, codes prescribe the minimum requirements. And jurisdictions, sub-jurisdictions, quasi-government bodies, contractors, owners, and authorities have the right to define and make the requirements more secure. And this is where commercial contracts come in place. It is a common example that, let's say, airports or airport authorities or hospital authorities, or in many countries, mass transport contracts or authorities or quasi-government authorities would write in specific and more detailed requirements, which may be over and above what the minimum requirements set in by the building codes or the fire codes of a given region. So yes, in my opinion, the authority with which, or the entity with which the commercial contract is in place, is their codes and their requirements take precedence. UAE codes are particular to any NFPA, IBS, and standards. So the fire and life safety code of practice takes in inputs from a lot of codes, NFPA, International Building Code, IBC, and it also takes in inputs from a lot of other learnings of professionals as well as people who have been close to the construction industry in the last 2 decades. Who is breaching the code below? Okay, this is a tough one. I'll try to read through an answer. A manufacturer chooses a listed lab certification body and tests the product against the standard not listed in the code. The certification body goes on issuing the UAE COC based on the COC of the product is approved by civil defense. The contractors install and the product based on the DCD approval and consultant signs off. Well, this is obviously a curveball, but from my understanding and from what I show in the slides earlier, it is the contractor's responsibility to ensure and cross-check and verify that the products that they are buying, so the contractor is the one who is placing an order to procure material, is based on correct compliance requirements. So in my opinion, I don't know who is breaching the code, but as far as my understanding goes, the contractor is responsible for ensuring that the things align. What are the fire test standards that are accepted by UAE Civil Defense? Example, BSEN 1634, BS 476. So there are lots and lots of standards which are accepted for various types of products in the code. And this again is a very unique part of the UAE code, that a specific product has often several different standards which are allowed to be used to demonstrate conformity. And here again, the interconnectivity of responsibility and liability comes in, wherein the consultants, designers, contractors are kind of jointly responsible for ensuring that the products and materials that they choose align with the theme and the ideology of the fire and life safety uh, plan of a given building. To detail further, for any type of occupancy, let's say a high-rise commercial building, which has been designed by an architect from Europe and has kept in mind European norms as norms which they use to design the fire and life safety plan of a building. Such a project is best implemented through uh, the compliance demonstrated through European norms. But that may not always be the case. And this is where the flexibility of contractors as well as liability of contractors comes into play. And it is up to their interpretation of which is the most accurately used standard. I'll give you another example that the cladding large-scale fire tests like the NFPA 285 as well as the BS 8414, though are listed as alternate standards, but there could be certain specific installations in at the building level, wherein because of the L-shaped mock-up for the BS 8414, the BS 8414 may be a more apt standard to create evidence to provide the assurance of fire safety. Moving on. When you call UAE has several approvals, when it is one country, why there is no understanding between civil defense bodies? Why then is it called UAE Fire and Fire Code when there is no unison between each emirate? This is a good question, very interesting. Again, typical curveballs. The UAE code is a federal code. Many countries have federal codes or central codes which are written in as minimum requirements set in by the country. India is another example. That India has the National Building Code, which is a federal code, wherein the states and municipalities have their own choice to implement their own understanding, their own interpretation of these codes, and often enough add in additional requirements. Next question. Label needs to be fixed in door alone or needs to be fixed in the frame too? Very often asked question. The labels should be used to define a door set. In the understanding of the UAE Fire and Life Safety Code of Practice, the door set or the door assembly, which is the frame and the leaf, are together approved from civil defense, and a label needs to define it. If a single label is there which covers both the leaf and the door, then so be it. If there are two labels for the door frame separate and leaf separate, they need to align. Another question Mayank loves. It's manufacturer's responsibility as he chooses certification body / lab, and it's their ownership in the whole process. I am sorry, this question is not clear. Let me move to the next question. From Hamad. What if the approved assembly changes from the tested assembly? Considering the changes are very minor, such as installation method, cavity gap, gap between facade panels. Great question, Hamad. I'm guessing who Hamad is, but probably my guess is right. In the cladding system and in the cladding approval process, the manufacturer or the supplier of material who is mandated to give two pieces of evidence. One, how the components comply to the requirements of the code. And the second is at least one system design or an assembly design where their specific material will work and not prove to be a fire hazard. It is important, Hamad, to know and understand that this assembly test is done by usually one or maybe two manufacturers coming together to create evidence to get a civil defense approval. This assembly test, which is done often for getting a civil defense approval of the manufacturer, need not be the assembly which is close to or is a replica of the requirement of a given project. It can be used for a given project maybe, but this is where the fire consultants and sometimes even the contractors have to take ownership and understand the fire risk of several design details of cladding systems. And this is where it is really important to have that level of confidence from the cladding design or the cladding test report. If you or the fire consultant can see that there is a difference between what was mocked up and installed and proven to be safe versus what is on the project, whether it's a cavity gap or gap in the facade panels or installation method. In our practical understanding, installation methods, cavity gaps are some of the reasons which actually cause a system to fail. So I feel it is important to look at these aspects very, very closely, specific to that project, and review them. Yes, this webinar will be shared as a recording. So everybody who has registered will get a link and will get a copy to it. Last question. The UL door assembly fire certificate do not provide complete detail. If we compare it with TBW, what is the solution? Well, if there is a requirement from a contractor's point of view, you should reach out to the manufacturer of the door supplier, and they should be able to supply these details for you. All right, Craig, thanks for the detailing. And I am going to close the webinar now. Thank you very, very much for the attendance. I look forward to seeing you all again in the next webinar, which is at the end of the month. Some of the questions that have been pouring in now after 4, I will reach back to you and reply to these questions, probably in a one-to-one call or an email. Thank you very, very much to everybody for joining in today. I hope the session was interesting and useful, and look forward to supporting you in the near future. Bye-bye for today.